Dear friends, the mystery of the Egyptian pyramids has long occupied the minds of researchers around the world. Hundreds of books and thousands of scientific articles have been written about these ancient structures. Nearly every detail has been documented and measured down to the millimeter. But despite the huge number of hypotheses put forward, experts still do not have even a rough understanding of how the pyramids were built. In an attempt to find at least some clue, scientists scan them in every possible way and launch robots into the shafts. But the mystery of their construction remains unsolved. However, maybe we are just looking in the wrong places. Perhaps we're trying to complicate things so much, putting so much faith in modern, high-tech research methods that we're missing out on the simplest and most obvious things. What if, to unravel the mysteries hidden beneath millions of tons of stone, we don't need to conduct 1,000 measurements, but can simply determine only one number? You've probably heard many suggestions that the ancient builders recorded their knowledge of the world around us in the Great Pyramid of Khufu. By examining the geometric dimensions of this pyramid and the various relationships between them, researchers discovered that the architects had encoded in it the number of days in a year, the parameters of our planet, the distance from the Earth to the Sun, basic mathematical constants, and much more. Renowned pyramid researchers of the early 20th century, the brothers John and Morton Edgar, even believed that the Great Pyramid is a Bible in stone, built to reveal prophetic truths about the end of the world, and that the dimensions of the pyramid's corridors encode a chronology of biblical events. I, of course, do not claim to possess such sacred knowledge, and believe that most of the mathematical relationships discovered are simple coincidences that arose not by the will of ancient architects, but thanks to the laws of statistics. Nevertheless, I am certain that there was indeed one constant that played a key role not only in the construction of the Khufu pyramid, but also fundamentally influenced the entire pyramid building process. One value that largely determined the construction methods of these enormous ancient monuments and the geometry of their internal structure. It is this important number that will be discussed in this video. In my previous videos, I put forward the hypothesis that during the construction of the pyramids, the blocks were lifted with the help of a counterweight, which was people, and pits like those we see at Abu Rawash and Zawiat el-Aryan weren't just used for constructing chambers. They were an essential part of the mechanism for lifting building materials. Platforms with counterweights were lowered into them, and the people who acted as this counterweight then ascended the sloping ramp. This method originated in ancient Egypt even before the first pyramid was built, and was used to construct stairway tombs. That's why builders always created a central shaft and inclined stairs inside them. It was this system of inclined stairs and chambers that later became the prototype for the internal structure we see in the Pyramid of Djoser and most subsequent pyramids. And when the chambers and corridors in the Great Pyramids of Meidum, Djoser, and Giza rose above ground level, so did the pits and ramps. Only these pits were created not in the rocky foundation under the pyramid, but directly in the masonry of blocks. We can see what this looked like in the Pyramid of Sahur, the ruler of the 5th dynasty. I described all of this in detail in previous parts. However, to continue our journey toward understanding how these grandiose structures were built, we must at some point move from analyzing general principles to determining specific numerical parameters. We need numbers. We need some quantitative characteristics that we can rely on to move forward. And I believe from this perspective, the hypothesis under consideration has one enormous advantage. For example, if we assume that the pyramids were erected this way, with the blocks simply hauled up ramps by hand, or, say, lifted along their sides in the manner described by Herodotus, we can hardly expect to discover any mathematical regularities associated with the construction process. After all, it essentially makes no difference how far you haul a block, 3 meters closer or 5 meters further. For such methods, the specific dimensions of the pyramids are also unimportant. Of course, the dimensions will certainly influence the overall volume of work required, but they are unlikely to have a significant impact on the design process. But if a counterweight lifting technology was used for construction, then the entire system, no matter how complex and multi-stage it was, had to have one critical parameter: the maximum length of the ropes used. Because such ropes had to be produced in huge quantities, I want to clarify right away that we're not talking about the maximum theoretical length. One rope can even be made a kilometer long. We need to find a standard, because if the proposed hypothesis about the use of a counterweight is correct, then this standard value would have been a key parameter in the design of the pyramids and would have been taken into account repeatedly in various aspects of construction. So our task is, first, to determine this standard rope length, and second, to understand how exactly this length influenced the pyramid design process. That is, to find features, geometric regularities, or patterns in the internal system of these structures that could be explained by this value. And thirdly, for a complete picture, it would be desirable to understand at what point exactly this standard for rope length appeared, how and when it changed, if of course such changes occurred. Let's start from the beginning. How can we even approximately determine this key value? The idea of how to do this came to me while studying the drawings of the pyramids of Pharaoh Snefru. It's not hard to see that in the larger pyramids, the highest points of the corridors are raised significantly above ground level. Even in the Pyramid of Khafre, both chambers of which are located below ground level, the corridor still rises high. What could this have been done for? As is well known, to create corridors below ground level, inclined ramps were cut into pits. Only the presence of such a straight ramp allowed for a straight corridor to be laid above it. Consequently, in the large pyramids for the corridors located above the surface level, similar ramps had to be created, but directly in the block masonry. In my opinion, there was simply no other way to ensure the straightness of the corridor layout. I believe that the upper edge of exactly such a ramp is what we see at the entrance to the Khufu pyramid. I've highlighted it in Frank Monier's sketch. And if so, it's reasonable to assume that these ramps were used to lift the blocks and that a counterweight moved along them. Perhaps it was some kind of platform, or they were simply people pulling ropes, thus using both their weight and their muscle power. It's a very simple and very effective method, and I think the ancient builders simply couldn't ignore such a possibility. Now let's look at the pyramids, whose corridors are raised higher than all the others. These are the red and bent pyramids of Pharaoh Snefru. Interestingly, despite the pyramids' identical overall heights, the tops of their corridors are at slightly different levels. However, because the pyramids' angles are different, the distances along the face from the tops of the corridors to the base are the same. This coincidence suggests that the builders were likely concerned not with the exit height itself, but with this distance along the face, because the length of the ropes used had to be enough to reach from the bottom point to the ramp. In both pyramids, this distance is approximately 41 meters. Therefore, the length of the ropes was equal to this value, plus some allowance for securing the load, placing the pulley, and placing the people. This is, of course, only a rough estimate, but it gives us an idea of the acceptable range of values for such an important parameter. And now, as strange as it may sound, I am ready to name the exact value of the sought quantity. The ancient Egyptians measured length in royal cubits. 1 cubit equals 52 centimeters and 4 millimeters. And quite logically, the builders chose a round number for such an important parameter: 100. That is, the maximum length of the ropes was 52.4 meters. As soon as this idea occurred to me, I, of course, immediately began searching for information about the numeral system used in ancient Egypt. Unlike the system we are familiar with, it wasn't positional, but at the same time, it was decimal. It had its own symbols for each power of 10. So for them, 100 truly was a round number. But what intrigued me most was the symbol used to represent this number. It's a rope with a loop. Apparently, such ropes were produced in such vast quantities that their length even determined the symbol for the number 100. Some sources also indicate that ropes of this length were used to measure land plots. If so, this only confirms my assumption that this length was the standard for manufactured ropes. And what is very important, this guess has one more crucial argument. The fact is that all the pits whose dimensions we can determine have a depth of 22 meters. The pit in Zawiyat el-Aryan, the pit in Abu Rawash. The pit created for the lower chamber of the bent pyramid also had this depth. Furthermore, in the Khufu pyramid, the king's chamber is vertically separated from the queen's chamber by the same 22 meters. I've always been curious about the reason for this kind of standardization, and now it seems to me the answer is obvious. The angle of inclination of the descending ramp in all these pits is almost the same and is equal to approximately 26 degrees. And with this ramp angle and a pit depth of 22 meters, the ramp length is just over 50 meters. That is, the standard depth of the pit was chosen so that the length of the ropes would be sufficient to lower heavy blocks for the construction of the chamber and filling the space around it. I've previously discussed the basic principle behind the development of the first pyramid designs, which I was able to understand by analyzing their drawings. According to this principle, to increase the size of each subsequent pyramid, the designs weren't scaled up as they would be today, but rather a new part was added to the previous design. Moreover, this part was added not from above, but from below. What's crucial is that this development occurred in precisely 22-meter increments. This is clearly visible if we compare the pyramid drawings and align them with their apices. Matum pyramid, red pyramid, bent pyramid. Moreover, even the pit of the pyramid in Abu Rawash fits perfectly into this latter. Furthermore, let's compare the heights of the first pyramids. The pyramid of Djoser is 60 meters high. The Matum pyramid is usually considered to be 92 meters high, but that's assuming it had been fully developed into a true pyramid. As it was, its height was approximately 82 meters, 22 meters more than the pyramid of Djoser. The red and bent pyramids are 104 meters high, another 22 meters more. And in the pyramid of Khufu, the designers added two 22-meter increments, resulting in the famous 147.7 meters. I am confident that such quantization of the pyramid's heights and the placement of their internal chambers can only be attributed to construction technology. The fact that the pyramids were built in 22-meter increments and that the chambers are spaced 22 meters apart suggests that the construction of the central part of the pyramids occurred in stages. The coincidence of the height of each such stage with the standard depth of the pits only confirms the previously expressed hypothesis that the chambers located above ground level were also built in improvised pits created directly in the masonry of the pyramids, and this entire internal system was part of the mechanism for lifting the blocks during construction. And now we have the opportunity to understand how the developmental steps of this system are related to the standard length of the ropes. Let's move to Saqqara, to the pyramid of Djoser. It was here, in the 27th century BC, that the development that would lead to the construction of the pyramid of Khufu just 100 years later began. Scholars still debate the exact trigger for the construction of this first Egyptian pyramid. What idea, event, or technological innovation served as the impetus for its construction? What exactly was the brilliant solution of the great Imhotep? Of course, you could say that it was at this point that the ancient Egyptians developed new stoneworking techniques, and you'd be absolutely right. Before this, even the largest mastabas were built from unbaked bricks and gravel, and the Pyramid of Djoser was the first large structure constructed entirely of stone blocks. There's no doubt that this important factor truly influenced the capabilities of ancient builders, and most likely, a pyramid built from clay bricks would have simply crumbled under its own weight. We don't have to look far for an example. The pyramids of the 12th dynasty, built almost 1,000 years after the Pyramid of Djoser during the Middle Kingdom. They were built from unbaked bricks, and despite their strong stone frame, they now look more like uneven hills than true pyramids. However, despite the rationality of this argument, stonework methods could not have been the sole reason for the construction of the first pyramid, because at the initial stage of its construction, a mastaba was erected. Yes, a large one, made of stone with a well-aligned facing, but a mastaba nonetheless. It was subsequently added to twice more, but then something happened that prompted the builders to abandon all their previous achievements and build a pyramid on top of this mastaba in 2 stages. What could this have been? To solve this problem, let's try to answer another important question. What length of ropes were used to build Djoser's pyramid? Before the first pyramid, the Egyptians built a huge number of mastabas. How I think this happened, I already told in this video. The central shaft, a necessary attribute of any tomb, was used to lower a counterweight, which was performed by people, and these people then returned back to the surface to repeat the cycle again and again. This is why inclined staircases appeared in tombs, and that is why in most tombs, the distance from the shaft to the edge of the mastaba is equal to the depth of the underground part of the shaft. In small mastabas, this shaft might be shallow, but for royal mastabas, they obviously tried to make the mastabas as large as possible, and the shaft, accordingly, as deep as possible. How were these shafts dug? There was only one option. People would descend, break through the soil, or rock with whatever they could, and then climb back up, and so on for many months in a row. What could limit this process? The answer is obvious: the length of the ropes, because there was no other way to descend into the shaft and retrieve the mined rock except by ropes. In other words, if the builders wanted to make the shaft as deep as possible, its depth was equal to the maximum length of the ropes used. However, after the shaft was completed, an above-ground part of the tomb was created on top, and the shaft passed through it. Consequently, the length of the ropes at this final stage may no longer be sufficient. Therefore, the builders had to either initially make the shaft shallower or provide for the possibility of workers exiting in the middle of the shaft. I believe this is why such strange burial chamber configurations are sometimes found in shafts. The lower one was used at the beginning of construction, the upper one at the end. In this way, the builders attempted to optimize rope handling at different stages of the tomb's construction. Most likely, mastabas like these, with 2 shafts of different depths, were constructed using a similar principle. I think the same logic was used in the creation of the so-called stair shafts. These are believed to have been a transitional form between stairway tombs and shaft tombs. Here is a diagram of the so-called Mastaba T on the Giza Plateau, also known as the Covington Tomb, which dates back to the 3rd Dynasty. Note that the height of this vertical segment of the shaft was equal to the height of the above-ground part. Let's try to determine the length of the ropes used to create it. This length of rope was required during the shaft excavation phase. At the end of construction, due to the presence of steps, these same ropes were sufficient for the construction of the above-ground part, since workers who had descended the shaft could exit before reaching the very bottom of the shaft and climb up the stairs. This means that these stair shafts were a more advanced version of the standard incline staircases. In stairway tombs, the length of the ropes corresponded to the full depth of the shaft, while in stair shafts, only to the depth of the underground section. And this assumption is confirmed by the fact that the second segment of the shaft in Mastaba T has exactly the same depth. It was excavated as deep as the ropes would allow. And I would like to draw your attention to this important point separately. The development of ancient Egyptian tombs occurred gradually over many centuries. It's been described in considerable detail in the literature. However, the meaning of this development isn't fully understood. The idea that all these transformations were driven solely by a desire for maximum burial safety, as Reqâqnah argues in his book, doesn't hold up to scrutiny, in my opinion. But if we accept the version that the underground part of the tomb during construction served as a tool for creating the above-ground part, then everything immediately falls into place. If people descended into these shafts during the construction of the mastaba to act as a counterweight, then it immediately becomes clear why all these inclined staircases were created, why it was necessary to cut several vertical shafts, and why in later mastabas we see shafts of varying depths and strange configurations of burial chambers. Ancient engineers were simply trying to optimize the construction process and build faster and more with the resources available. An example of precisely this kind of optimization, in my opinion, are stair shafts, which allow for more efficient use of the length of ropes. At the same time, one cannot help but notice that the configuration of the underground part of the Djoser pyramid and the southern tomb located next to it represents just such a stair shaft. The depth of these shafts is 27 meters, or nearly 50 ancient Egyptian cubits. The shaft in Mastaba K1, which was built shortly before construction of Djoser's pyramid, has the same total depth. All three of these tombs were built for pharaohs, so it's clear that their shafts were constructed as deep as possible. It turns out that these 50 cubits were the maximum length of ropes available at the time, and the builders used this value to determine the depth of the shafts. And there is one more confirmation of this. The inclined staircases in both Djoser's pyramid and the southern tomb were constructed using two segments. It's logical to assume this was done because the ropes simply weren't long enough to lower the heavy stones in one go. Therefore, the descent was divided into two sections. At the lower end of the upper segment of the staircase in the southern tomb, we see a recess in the wall. There's a matching recess in the opposite wall. These were obviously necessary for the logs to which the ropes were tied. Don't be confused by the remaining masonry we see in the passage. It simply wasn't completely cleared. Originally, there were 2 rows of steps and a smooth slope down the middle. We see roughly the same thing on the ramp in the Zawiyat El Aryan excavation pit. By the way, neither in this pit nor in the pit in Abu Rawash are there any notches visible in the middle of the ramps on the walls. And this tells us that the length of the ropes there was sufficient to lower the load in one go. So it turns out that the central mastaba beneath Djoser's pyramid was built with a maximum rope length of 50 cubits. What happened next? I think you already know the answer. The maximum rope length was doubled, and this new standard of 100 cubits, or 52 meters, 40 centimeters, subsequently became the main parameter in the design of the Great Pyramids and lasted apparently at least until the end of the reign of the 6th dynasty. I am confident that it is precisely because of this standard that we see continuity in the development of pyramid designs. If this standard had changed, the dimensions of all the intermediate construction stages, the depths of the pits, and the distances between chambers would have changed. As for the mastaba beneath Djoser's pyramid, while previously the ropes were sufficient to reach the edge of the mastaba, this upgrade made it possible to build a larger sand ramp and continue hauling blocks up it. I believe this explains why the subsequent extensions are slightly lower than the central section. This change in standard is confirmed by the fact that during the third stage of the pyramid's construction, the M3 extension was added to the side of the central mastaba. 11 vertical shafts were dug beneath this extension. Here's how they appear on the plan from above. According to Lauer's research, at least the fourth and fifth shafts passed through the extension, while the first, second, and third shafts most likely did. The depth of the shafts varies between 32 and 36 meters. Let's add here the height of the above-ground part, and we get a total depth of more than 40 meters. Never before had shafts been made so deep. Only a radical increase in the length of the ropes could allow their creation to be completed. This raises another important question. Could these shafts have been an additional tool for the construction of the first 40-meter-tall pyramid, which was then increased to 60 meters during the final stage of construction? If the central shafts in mastabas were used to lift building materials, then perhaps these were used in the same way. We won't try to give a precise answer to this question now, but I still want to share one interesting observation with you. Here's a drawing of the Djoser pyramid. Its base measures 109 by 120 meters. We're looking at the long side right now. So that you can check me, I will display the coordinate grid. And here's a drawing of the Khufu pyramid to the same scale. Its base is 230 meters long. Earlier, I suggested that it had vertical shafts for the movement of the counterweight. Now let's try to align the pyramids relative to their apices. Notice how the shaft of Djoser's pyramid aligns with the king's chamber and the relieving chambers of the Khufu pyramid. Moreover, the southern incline channels abut the vertical line of additional shafts under the M3 extension. Could all this be a simple coincidence? Or are such geometric patterns also dictated by the specifics of the overall construction technology? I think we'll be able to figure this out later. Next to the three great pyramids on the Giza Plateau are the so-called satellite pyramids. They were built for the wives and immediate family members of the great pharaohs. To avoid confusion over their difficult-to-pronounce names, scholars have come up with short alphanumeric designations for them. These structures have survived to this day in varying states of preservation, allowing us to trace the sequence of their construction. First, builders erected the inner core, consisting of steps on which backing stones were then laid, and then the casing blocks were installed on top of them. Remnants of this casing can still be seen here and there on the lower rows. I believe that if we want to understand how the Egyptian pyramids were built, it's crucial to understand the construction methods of these relatively simple satellite pyramids, and only then try to extrapolate them to more complex structures. These small pyramids have no excavation pits or chambers with corridors above ground level. They are simply blocks, carefully stacked one on top of the other. In the comments to previous videos, I've often been asked how I think the tops of the larger pyramids were constructed. I'm confident the answer is very simple. They were built in the same way as these satellite pyramids. What might their construction process have looked like? To understand this, let's pay attention to one very important detail. The average size of the blocks that make up the core does not decrease with height. Yes, larger blocks are often found at the very bottom, but further up, the average weight of the blocks does not decrease from step to step. This is especially evident in the satellite pyramid, G3b, located next to the pyramid of Menkaure. We see neatly stacked blocks, approximately 1 meter high, on all the steps of the core. I believe this feature tells us that the angle at which these blocks were lifted upward was uniform. Otherwise, the builders would have varied the weight of the blocks, depending on the angle of ascent. What are the possible options here? It would seem that the blocks could be raised from step to step. However, the steps have a slight slope, which is obviously extremely inconvenient for vertical ascent. In addition, the size of the ledge in front of the last step is very small. The block being lifted would barely fit on it, and it would hardly have been possible to place any lifting mechanism there. The only remaining option is a ramp. It would be possible to create an external ramp and gradually build it up. But then the volume of this ramp at the end would exceed the volume of the pyramid itself. So this option was possible for the first rows, but hardly rational for the entire pyramid as a whole. So what's left? I think a temporary ramp could have been created from small blocks or clay bricks running from step to step. Its volume would have been relatively small. Each section would have rested on the next step, which would undoubtedly have increased its stability and allowed for its extension and repair in sections. There could be several such ramps, and they could go on all four sides for ease of feeding and installation of blocks. To help you imagine what I mean, look at this photograph of the Pyramid of Unas. It shows a restored section of the casing. I suppose that this is exactly what this temporary ramp could have looked like, only it was, of course, not made to such high quality. And crucially, this approach allows the same block lifting method to be used both at the core creation stage and at the casing installation stage. The only remaining question is how the blocks could have been lifted up these ramps. It would certainly have been possible to move the counterweight along the same face as the block being lifted. However, I believe it would have been much simpler to move the counterweight along the opposite face. Stone inserts like these, found by archaeologist Selim Hassan on the Giza Plateau and dating back to the Old Kingdom, would have been perfectly suitable for this method. One insert was made of basalt, the other of dark slate. This, of course, is not exactly a pulley in our modern sense, but to change the vector of force, such stone tools could well have been used in the construction of the pyramids. And this idea of the counterweight moving along the opposite edge has another very important argument. It's the dimensions of the satellite pyramids themselves. They all have bases less than 100 cubits long. If the ancient builders had sought to embody some sacred standard in their pyramid designs, they would have made them all the same size. But the fact is, their dimensions vary. This suggests that this 100-cubit limitation was most likely not dictated by any religious or artistic considerations, but rather a technical requirement during construction. What could its meaning have been? The fact is that with a rope length of 100 cubits, or 52 meters, and a face angle of less than 60 degrees, the ropes were always sufficient to move the blocks along the opposite face. That is, thanks to such a limitation on the size of the base, all the blocks could be lifted in one go. It turns out that, and for these small pyramids, the standard rope length of 100 cubits we discovered played a key role, essentially determining their dimensions. As you can see, we have growing evidence to support the idea that people were used as counterweights to lift building materials during the construction of Egyptian pyramids and mastabas. This hypothesis provides a rational explanation for the changes in the configuration of the underground parts of tombs that occurred in ancient Egypt over many centuries. Furthermore, as I've shown in this and previous videos, there is a clear correlation between the depth of the shafts and the dimensions of the above-ground parts of the tombs. Such patterns could not have arisen by chance. This correlation indicates that these shafts were used as tools during construction for the mastabas themselves. And the fact that the layout of the underground part of the stairway tombs became the prototype of the internal system that we see in the Pyramid of Djoser and subsequent pyramids tells us that these methods of lifting building materials were also used for the construction of large pyramids. This is entirely logical and only confirms the gradual development of construction technologies in ancient Egypt during the early dynasties. And what is very important, the block lifting technology under consideration has one basic parameter: the maximum length of the ropes used. After all, a huge number of such ropes were required. We see how, even before the construction of the first pyramid, the ancient Egyptians attempted to optimize the configuration of the underground portion of their tombs precisely to use rope length more efficiently. When the shaft and the original mastaba were built on the site of the future pyramid of Djoser, the standard rope length was 50 cubits, which determined the shaft's depth of 27 meters. But this standard length was later doubled, allowing the first pyramid to be erected on top of the mastaba. And this standard of rope length of 100 cubits, in fact, determined the geometry of the internal structure of subsequent pyramids. It is precisely because of its immutability that we see continuity in the development of the first pyramid designs and the uniform step with which the pyramids grew in relation to each other. This standard also influenced virtually every aspect of construction, being a natural limitation on the distance that blocks could be moved in one go. It determined the maximum height of the corridor exits, as well as the dimensions of the small pyramids. I'd also like to point out that the emergence of this standard wasn't necessarily tied solely to the labor-intensive nature of rope production, and most likely its numerical value was influenced by a large number of different requirements and restrictions associated with the building process and technological methods of the time period under consideration. Does knowledge of this very important parameter allow us to answer all questions? Of course not. However, I am confident that determining the value of this key constant is both a serious argument in favor of the proposed hypothesis and a major step forward in our quest to unravel the mystery of the construction of the Egyptian pyramids. Dear friends, let me know in the comments what you think of the ideas presented in this video. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. You can also support this channel financially. The link is in the description. This is very important for continuing my work and creating future videos. Thank you so much for your time and attention.